Hey everyone, thanks for joining us in person and online. We're actually in the middle of a discussion we started here, and I think it's a good place to sort of pivot, and we can take a deal with this question sort of on the front end of today's session together. So before we do that, let's begin in prayer, and then we will get started. Let's pray. God, thank you for continuing to challenge us in Scripture, challenge us with voices not only of Jesus, but as we are discussing, the voice of a Syrophoenician woman. Help us to be inspired, to feel God breathe as a result of engaging this text. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So we were just having a discussion on the story of Jesus in Tyre encountering the Syrophoenician woman. That's what I had preached on this past Sunday. I'll put a link there in the information. So if you want to go back and listen to that sermon, you can. But that'll be available. And so the question Carolyn has asked for us here in our in-person group is essentially kind of the root of it is, why is Jesus in Tyre? Am I right in saying that? Like, so he's in this Gentile region. And you said you had the understanding maybe he was going there to preach to Gentiles, yet at the same time, his response to the woman seems to say, I'm not here to talk to you. Okay, so one thing I'll point out, and we actually talked about this in our deep dive follow-up this last week, but I can address it here too, is that Mark doesn't tell us why he goes there. It just says he goes there. Amy and I talked about that a bit because she tends to favor or appreciate the interpretation that Jesus going to Tyre, and the text says that he's doing, it seems to indicate he's trying to keep himself pretty private in doing this, because the Syrophoenician woman, the word's out, she hears it and comes and finds him in a private setting. The interpretation I think Amy said she appreciates is that maybe this is Jesus like being worn out and just trying to withdraw. We had seen Jesus do this already before. A lot of these crossings where he would cross was him withdrawing, or he would the crowd would push in on him so much he'd get on a boat just to get away from being crushed. I think that's probably even a lens one might interpret these feedings like we'll deal with today, the feeding of the 4,000, but the prior feeding of the 5,000. Well, he's in the middle of the wilderness. In both examples, one, and the first one, 5,000, it says they're not even around nearby towns. They're just out there. This one, they said they've been following him for 3 days. So he's not in some, it just makes me wonder is he, I doubt it is Jesus's strategic vision to say, let's go in the middle of nowhere and just see who shows up. These might have been attempts for him to get some privacy. And so I think that's an interesting interpretation. I think ultimately, if that bears fruit in you understanding or breathing life in the story, that's fine. I don't really have a dog in that show because Mark doesn't bother to tell us. It does open that response, which I think you're nailing exactly right, where Jesus says, it's not right to take the food from the little children and give it to the dogs. I think your interpretation of what he's saying there is absolutely right. And I talk about this a bit in the sermon, that the use of the word little children is absolutely coded for Israel. That's clear throughout biblical traditions. And so, Jesus is just essentially saying, it's not right for me to give you the good news when I haven't given it to the Jews first. Within the messianic expectations, they certainly believe, a Messiah would come as a political liberator. We'll actually talk about that a little bit today. A little bit more on Sunday too. And but it was always a belief that there would probably be enough for the Gentiles, but that's only after that Israel itself was liberated. Then we can work on to defeating injustice to the ends of the earth. And so Jesus himself at this point in his ministry seems to himself almost live into that expectation of a Messiah. So one of the more radical interpretations of this, and I don't think there's anything that necessarily goes against this, is that one might interpret this as this encounter with this Syrophoenician literally changes Jesus's conception of what a Messiah could be, or helps open that door to, okay, I've done my piece for Israel. It's time to move on. Because that is absolutely in the second pericope we'll deal with in our Bible study today. That Jesus just seems to be like, done with you all. You don't get it. And then we've reached a point in Mark's gospel today, because we'll be specifically looking at chapter 8, verses 1 through 21. We've reached a point in Mark's gospel where the tone and literally the direction Jesus is going completely shifts. So far, all he's been going west and east and west and east and west and east. All of a sudden, we're going south now as he sets his eyes towards Jerusalem. And we will encounter on Sunday the first of the really explicit passion predictions of the Son of Man and his incoming demise. So, the presence of the Syrophoenician woman, I think that's a fair interpretation, that either she actually did that, or Mark is using that story as a way to sort of continue to set that stage for that. I don't think either interpretation robs the power of it, because you can interpret all the way from a more feminist perspective, in the sense that she is resisting, to a womanist perspective that she is sassing him back and therefore winning in that, or even just a more traditionalist interpretation where she sort of understands, but just maybe gently prods back. There's been a lot of debate, and if you are, I think we've talked about this before, on the realm of on the spectrum of theological interpreters, you have fundamentalists that are typically biblical literalists, or they will say that they will take the parts that they like literally, and the parts that they don't like, they will discard or write away. But in a more literalist interpretation, a lot of those folks who fall in the apologists category try to find a way to interpret this as Jesus not saying a slur, because we can't live with this, Jesus saying a slur in text. Whereas if you're on the other end, and it's not a binary here, but there's all sorts of things in between, and no one firmly fits in it. If you're at the other end, maybe you're just not that, you don't care about that as much. One of the things I will say, at least in my reading, I engaged is we got to make sure to say that phrase, the point of that phrase was not for Jesus to call her a dog. The point of that phrase was the little children part of it. Maybe he could have said it better and just said, look, I hear you. You're obviously suffering. You obviously got a faith. I'm not really here for you. That's kind of what he's intending to say. But he says something that across every culture, calling, even passively inferring that she is a dog by nature of her not being one of the children, it's potentially problematic. So that's a challenge of the text. But again, this is why faith is often called the way. It's following, it's listening, it's obedience, it's wrestling, not I have the magic answer key to everything. So yeah, and I've argued for a while that someone should do a radical interpretation of the prophet Isaiah, or not Isaiah, Jeremiah, excuse me, because Jeremiah, by most interpreter standards, is foul-mouthed and coarse. And you can also tell that because most contemporary responses to Jeremiah were shocked. So it'd be interesting if someone did a pretty blunt interpretation of that. I don't think some of them, particularly when it was talking about Israel and its promiscuity with other gods, would be Sunday morning appropriate. But all right, so today we're going to read Mark 8, 1 through 21. We are going to be heavily referencing things before and things afterwards, but we'll try to stick to these couple of pericopes just here. And yes, so do I have someone that could volunteer and read for us the first of those pericopes, which is the feeding of the 4,000, which I believe goes through Verse 10. So 1 through 10. Would someone read that for us? Okay, hold on. I'm going to hand you this. Yeah, you can read it from any version. So the one Bob is going to read for us here actually comes from it's the N.T. Wright version, which is his own sort of translation of it. I don't know if he goes all the way through 10 in there. He might just go through 9. But
Okay.
all right, I'm going to read a different version. Okay, go ahead.
In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them will have come a long way. And his disciples answered him, How can one feed these men with bread here in the desert? And he asked them, How many loaves have you? They said, 7. And he commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he commanded that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went back to the district of Dalmanutha, whatever.
Oh yeah, that funny place, the Damathau. Yeah, however you pronounce that.
Manthusa.
Dalmanutha. Yep. We'll talk about that a little bit later because that's a place there's not a lot of confidence on understanding what that even is.
I should have checked my own.
We've also reached a point, at least with some of the locations, that some of the archaeology is even calling into question our previous conceived notions of them. So, anyways, obviously, you caught the obvious thing right off the bat. You've heard this story to some degree before. Just a couple chapters before, in Mark 6, you heard of the feeding of 5,000. But there's something else actually going on besides just 2 big feedings here. There is actually a cycle of events that are going to fully repeat. It's not immediately obvious, but it is absolutely there. So here, some scholars have called this the feeding cycle. It's a way of telling stories. And Mark 6:35 through 7:37 is the first one, is the first cycle of stories. And here, Mark 8:1 through 26 is going to follow an almost identical cycle. So here's what they are. Step 1, there's a feeding. Feeding of 5,000, feeding of 4,000. Step 2, there is a crossing and a landing. So immediately after the feeding, Jesus hops on a boat and crosses and lands. Step 3, there's a controversy with the Pharisees. So in chapter 7, you have the controversy with the Pharisees where they're accusing the disciples of eating with unclean hands. Okay? And then here, as we will read later today, Jesus has a controversy with the Pharisees about the request for a sign. Okay? 3 is a funny, strange story that deals specifically with an element of bread. So in the Syrophoenician story, the root of it is bread. Who's the bread for? The children's bread. Can the dogs have the bread crumbs? And then here in this story is Jesus talking about the mystery of the loaves, the leaven, the whole business about the loaves and the leaven. So we're talking about bread. And then finally, this concludes with a healing that seems like it's directly from the prophet Isaiah. In the case of chapter 7, 31 through 37, it's the healing of the deaf man who has trouble speaking. And here it's going to be, it ends, and we won't deal with it. It'll actually deal with it a little more directly on Sunday, is a healing of a blind. One of Jesus's more interesting healings because he doesn't seem to get it right the first time. Spits his hand, touches his eyes, asks the man what he can see. He can only see trees. People like trees. And then he goes back and does it again. And then he seems to be okay. It's interesting. So feeding, hops on a boat, has a controversy with the Pharisees, has some funny talk about bread, and then ultimately heals someone in a way that seems to be straight out of the prophet Isaiah. So that this is, again, Mark, the person that is not necessarily telling a sequential story, because he's got Jesus going all over the place on a boat, which seems really impractical. I'm going to talk to here. I'm going to go to the other side and have a short little conversation. I'm going to go to the other side and walk out in the wilderness. I'm going to go to the other side. What Mark is doing here is telling stories that mirror each other, just like the healing stories that often can sound like other healing stories, in order to push forward these themes. So the big part about this thing, and the big distinction about this, is not explicit in the text. It's something that's implied, because Jesus, if you remember his journey, he's in Tyre. He goes up to Sidon, which is a Gentile area. And instead of heading straight back down to Capernaum or the Gennesaret or that area there, he takes this long way around and does this big loop around the Sea of Galilee through the Decapolis. 9 of the 10 cities, Decapolis, 10 cities, 9 of the 10 are to the east of Galilee. And so it is implied, because it says these people have been following for Jesus for 3 days. And it says they have traveled from great distance, which is a term that in Mark to this point has been exclusively associated with Gentiles. It's implied, even though it does not specifically say he is in Gentile territory. Other things that support that is it says he's going across. After this, he goes across to that Demanatha place. Best we can believe, that is a place that is on the western shore of Galilee. So if you're going across, it means you would have been coming from the eastern side. So the first healing of the 5,000, that is clearly in Jewish territory. Now this feeding of the 4,000, clearly in Gentile territory. Big themes as a result of that. What's interesting is this sort of process actually is picked up a little bit. This cycle is actually picked up a little bit in John's gospel, although it's not identical. In John 6, 1-5, there is a feeding of the multitude, immediately followed by a sea crossing. All 3 of them report the walking on the sea. Mark 6 and John 6 both report the walking on the sea. And then John has a request for a sign. Then after that, there's a discussion for bread, ultimately, and then there's Peter's confession, which is something that happens. So John's gospel, in many ways, follows this same sequence, although the details are largely different. So there's something to that. They're both trying to communicate something here in this process. So let's see. All right, subtle differences between them. Let's see. It says they had nothing to eat. In the 6th chapter of Mark, Jesus says, he looks out at the folks and he says, they're like sheep without a shepherd. That's Jesus's reason for wanting to feed them, which is kind of strange. But if you think symbolically, Israel and the role of a shepherd and the clear language of shepherd, think of Psalm 23, obvious examples here. And he had compassion on them and he taught the crowd. But here, he's worried that they walk such a great distance that they're okay now. But he said he's worried if they head back home, they're likely going to faint. And so there's really interesting things happening here. This is in a section where there's a lot of stuff going on that is meant to remind the reader of the Exodus. Wilderness, bread. Miraculous eating in the middle of the wilderness. This is meant to evoke the Exodus. And there's also language here that's meant to sort of play on 2 levels. So on the way, he said, if they didn't have something to eat on the way, they may faint. Well, that phrase "on the way" there has obvious connections to the way being the path of discipleship. So he's concerned. He sees them in many ways now as disciples. And then he says to faint. Faint is language that's picked up in the rest of the New Testament all the time to talk about growing weary in your faith, or losing one's resolve and faint. That's language that we hear in Paul, specifically in Galatians and in Hebrews. But it's also Old Testament language in Deuteronomy 20 and Proverbs 3. And so that's a little bit what's happening there. Um, when Jesus asked the disciples how many loaves of bread they have, they answer 7. There's all sorts of interesting language there that people have debated over the centuries. What is happening here? Are these numbers meaning something? So at the end of the feeding of the 5,000, there were 12 baskets left over. And someone goes, "Oh, 12? Well, that's a really important number in Israel's history." And that's also why Jesus probably has 12 disciples. Okay, that makes sense there. At the end of the feeding of the 4,000, there are 7 baskets remaining. Um, 7 is a term that can often mean complete. So maybe it's a whole world. Look, I think you're more than welcome to interpret that way. I think most scholars don't think it's meant to indicate anything that specific, because the point of these stories, particularly running in parallel, it's not really about the numbers, it's more about the location. The location is the most important symbolic thing here. Other differences between them is in Mark 6, when Jesus has the bread and the fish, it says he blesses them. Um, and then in Mark 8, when Jesus gets the bread, he gets the bread first and he gives thanks to it. Eucharistesis. Do you hear a word in there? Eucharistesis, Eucharist. So Eucharist, to give thanks. So this might be one of those early places where the church starts picking up on that language, which gets ultimately developed into the Lord's Supper. Obviously in more direct ways later, but that's definitely there. Um, the disciples are playing an active role in this feeding. In the first one, the disciples are the ones that provoke the feeding. They're the ones that come to Jesus and say, "We got to do something about this crowd." And this one, Jesus notices it, which is an interesting distinction. But in both stories, Jesus relies upon the disciples to actually conduct the feeding. Yeah.
Say this, but why did the disciples say what they did when they've already seen it?
Why do disciples seem to not get it?
No,
This is going to keep happening, right? That's going to be the whole Jesus rant here in a minute that we're going to read. Yeah, the disciples are baffling in their inability to understand. Yeah, it's like, do you not remember just what happened a couple weeks or months or even days? Who knows? Earlier. Yep. It's a great question. Mark doesn't seem to have a high opinion on the disciples, which is interesting because remember the original ending of Mark just ends with that empty grave and the disciples going running away in fear. So it's interesting. Yep. I'm glad you saw that. I don't have an answer for you on that. One final note about this healing here is, this feeding here is, I think this is another reason some people think the numbers about the how many baskets are left doesn't really mean anything, because the word they're using for baskets is completely different. This is just a weird Hebrew nerd thing. The baskets used, the word for basket that is used in the feeding of the 4,000, the second story, is a word for basket that when I would say basket to you, I think it's what you would think of for a basket. When I think of basket in this context, I'm thinking of something that more than likely maybe would sit in the middle of a table. It could be this big or this big. More than likely, what's indicated in this, it's the basket that would have held a loaf of bread. So to say that there were 7 baskets left, in some ways, in that context with that word, would have meant there were like 7 loaves left and maybe some little bits of fish, because the fish would have probably been pretty small. Um, correct. That is true. In the first case, when they said they had 12 baskets left, and I think this clues you into why the symbolism of where they are in this trying to convey a sense of abundance, I think, is so prevalent in this story. The baskets that they use, the word for basket they use in the first story is the word for a basket that would have been so large it could actually carry a person. So these are the type of basket one would use to carry things to a market. Enormous, an overabundance amount of things.
Little contrast here. In this one, he was talking Galilee, Nazareth area. People action.
Yep.
The Catholics. A lot of people turn out to be warehouses, raiding the traffic.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that is, you're actually stumbling upon a component of why Israelites would have hated the people from Tyre as well, is because in many ways, our modern world can tend to have a rural and urban divide. That was absolutely true back then. You would think in a more agrarian society, those who lived closer to the crops would have done better in times of famine, but that's not true because they didn't have the capacity to store these things. Their idea was get it done, get it harvested, get it out in the market, whereas cities had enormous storehouses. And so, that the question you might have is like, why would you be so angry at Tyre and these other places for stealing food off the table? It's because they had the ability to store it and keep their people better. To me, the difference between the thing about baskets further highlights the point that it's almost like an absurdist way of describing things, that like it's almost like Mark saying, look, by comparison here, there is so much more that the Messiah doesn't need to be confined to just Israel. There's so much more in that first healing or in that first feeding. There's an abundance in both places, but there's even so much more abundance at the feeding of the 5,000. And not only that, you fed 1,000 more people. The first. So I think those are better comparisons than necessarily the numbers per se. And the location is the key comparison. So remember, you're always using stories to interpret stories. Between these two stories, Syrophoenician woman says, well, even the dogs eat the crumbs. And so here, Jesus, in many ways, has physically actually demonstrated the expansion of the kingdom to the Gentiles, which is big. This would have been, like I had said with the Syrophoenician woman, this wouldn't have been just a regular old miracle. This would have been a profoundly politically, honestly, dangerous act. Because if he is a Messiah, here's this Messiah who's supposed to be for Israel, Messiahing for Gentiles. So there's one last thing. It flew into my mind and now has flown out. Oh yeah, and knowing what we know about the followers of Jesus, you're probably talking about quadruple that. But again, numbers are like, it's not. So that's probably, I don't know the language. I wouldn't hang too much on that. Yeah, I wouldn't hang too much on that. Yeah. Okay. So this happens. And immediately after this, we have the next step in that feeding cycle, which is verses 8 and 9, or sorry, 9 and 10. Let me read those again for us. Now there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. So, I don't know what it took. Jesus finally said, get out of here. And I guess they actually got out of there. He said, and immediately he got into a boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Okay. We don't know what this is. It's very confusing. Up until 19. Okay. An unknown place. Exactly. So here's our best guess. And we didn't even find this until 1970. All right. So in 1970, the Sea of Galilee was exceptionally low. And what so happens, and this is about the time that boat we've looked at, they found this boat, because it gets low enough that they find this boat stuck in the mud. But about 1970, it was exceptionally low, and it became possible to actually go out and investigate these areas in the mud immediately near the shore. So, so they found these walled enclosures down in the mud. They found one in Capernaum, and then they found one in Magdala, which would have been, a little south further on the western coast there. I'm going to put a big asterisk by the word Magdala. I believe it's on the other side of Tiberias. So it's actually quite a bit. Just hold on to that asterisk on Magdala, because that's a bit of a disputed thing. And then they found a possibly a third one of these sort of brick enclosured areas north of and near Magdala and west of Capernaum. So people have started to guess maybe one of these enclosures represented what would have been a harbor or an enclosed anchorage, maybe like a protected seawall area from where the Sea of Galilee was once lower. That's a theory because there is the Aramaic word that is used for that enclosure or anchorage is sort of right there with that word Dalmanutha. So we don't know, but we're just assuming it could have been either one of these. It could have been any one of these sites. It could have been Capernaum. It could have been Magdala, asterisk, or it could have been this other place where Jesus is clearly, again, thematically going from Gentile side back over to Jewish side, which makes sense because he's going to run into the Pharisees here in a second. The reason I'm putting an asterisk on Magdala is because there is an enormous debate happening right now within a lot of scholarship about Magdala because it directly relates to what some have purported to be the origin of the name Mary Magdalene. So it seems that a lot of people start making connections saying Mary Magdalene. Oh, she must have been from Magdala. Mary Magdalene is also a confusing character in the history of the church because so much of what people assume to know about her has nothing to do with actual text. It has more to do with a sermon a pope preached around Christmas, 400 or 500 years after anyone would have even known Mary Magdalene. We also have evidence that Mary Magdalene's reputation within the church is vastly different in the first century versus in later centuries. And so, because this pope made a connection between the prostitute with an unclean spirit that was healed early in the text and said, oh, well, we now know that's Mary Magdalene. There's nothing connecting them. In fact, we have actually now uncovered from earlier scripts of things that Mary Magdalene most likely would have been from Bethany, which is what the early church understood Mary Magdalene to be from. This really, yeah. I mean, there's a great paper on this. I'm not going to go into too much because I'm now getting beyond my depth of things here. But there's a great paper by a professor Duke. I believe you and I have talked about this before, where they're pointing out that there's some evidence in earlier manuscripts where some scribes literally just scratched out Mary that would have been a reference to Mary Magdalene and wrote Martha instead. And so, there's a lot about this because the prevailing theory is Magdala most likely means tower, just as Petros means rock. So, Simon became Simon Peter, Simon the Rock. Mary Magdalene could in many ways be interpreted within the early church as being Mary the Tower, as in Mary the Tower of Faith. Now, the reason I said put an asterisk on Magdala is because Magdala wasn't even established as a city until after the death of Jesus. And mm-hmm. Yep. We have that very unique story of her talking to the gardener that turned out to be Jesus. So I just say that as Magdala, we have to be careful when we talk about Magdala because there's a lot we don't necessarily know about it because it wasn't a city of enormous significance, and we've made associations with that in Mary Magdalene's name, which I don't think were proper inferences. So this is an area of biblical scholarship that's sort of up in the air right now as we continue to dig through sites and try to understand what's going on. So Jesus crosses the sea. So there's a thing that happens that people pointed this out is that when Jesus crosses the sea, one of two things happens: either nothing, he crossed the sea and he's on this other side, or it sort of triggers a moment when Jesus is teaching them something. So now in the case here, it doesn't really trigger anything. He just goes across and it says they go to this place and immediately confronted by Pharisees again. But Jesus is going to hop on a boat shortly after these stories to go to Bethsaida, and then all of a sudden we're going to see Jesus starting to teach either on the boat or immediately following it. So that's just something that happens. Let's see. A thing to point out, I think a final thing to point out as we transition from these sort of signs and these healings and these feedings is one of the things that differentiates Jesus from ancient healers. So I think we've talked about before that many times what Jesus does seems very much like folk healing. The idea that you would, like with last week when we in the sermon where we talked about Jesus spits in his hand to heal the man that's both deaf and mute. He puts his fingers in his ears, spits in his hand, touches his tongue. That's a very normal practice for a faith healer back then. The previous healings looked very similar to that. The difference is Jesus is not benefiting from these things in any way. The enormous feedings. Jesus is not getting gifts. He's not making money off this. That's very unique because a faith healer, they were a faith healer, but that was their profession. And yet Jesus is doing these acts of power that seem to show God's authority in him. And he's not personally benefiting from those things in any way, other than it just raises his status within the community, which that wouldn't necessarily have been a thing back then to behave in that way. So that's something that's going on. So let's pick it up. We're going to pick up at verse 11. And we're going to read 11, 12, and 13, and I'll read those for us. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them. And getting into the boat again, he went across to the other side. So he's boating all over the place here. So a couple things to point out in this text is, again, we have confrontation with the Pharisees. These have never gone great. Mark at this point, he's had some, but the Pharisees aren't necessarily in every scene. But after the very first confrontation, they got together with the Herodians and started to plot to kill Jesus. And so, the temperature on this pot just keeps getting hotter and hotter. They're asking him for a sign from heaven. A sign just means evidence of his biblical authority. And so the request from a sign from heaven probably just meant they were asking for a sign that was unequivocal in meaning like no one could deny it. Oh, it's clearly the Messiah. He's clearly the Messiah. Some unbelievable overarching sign from David, some overarching sign from God. It makes you wonder, right? Because we've followed the story to this point. What do you call all the things Jesus has been doing? But I guess in the minds of the Pharisees and obviously the disciples who aren't getting it, I guess they were equivocal. You could say, well, that's not good enough. Other people do signs like this, at least they thought. And so, somehow those things weren't seen as signs of divine power. There was a tradition within Israel that prophets had signs that proved that there were prophets, but people had disputed that throughout the ages. To be a prophet didn't necessarily mean you had to do those signs of power. It just meant you had to be someone who was willing and had the guts to speak for God or what you perceived to be God in that moment. Let's see. We talked about that idea that what's at play here is the imagery of Exodus, feeding in the wilderness. And so what's really being evoked in this section is a story from Exodus 16 and 17, where the people quarreled with Moses. Do you know that scene? It's it's the scene, Massa and Meribah. It's the scene from Exodus 16 and 17. You can go back and read this. And Moses responds to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord your God?" So Moses called the place Massa and Meribah because Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord. And so that's an element of what's happening here. They're being fed in the wilderness. And yet he's still receiving quarreling from these Pharisees. And so that there's that sort of overlay of Exodus imagery happening here. So there is a degree of irony here that he's doing all these signs in the wilderness. And let's see, by testing Jesus, asking for a sign, ironically, just after Jesus has fed the multitude in the wilderness, the Pharisees placed themselves in the role of the faithful Israelites who tested God and were therefore forbidden to enter the promised land. Isn't that wild? They are people whose hearts go astray, and they do not regard my ways. Therefore, in my anger, I swore they shall not enter my rest. That's Psalm 95. That some people have linked that to. Jesus hears this, and it says he deeply sighs. Now, Jesus, before he heals the man in the Gentile territory with the plugged up ears and the inability to speak, Jesus has a deep sigh. Or is it there, or is it with the Syrophoenician woman? I'm sorry. Um, no, it's with the man. Yeah, sorry, it's with the man. Jesus sighs before he does that healing. Here is an intensification of that. So the first sigh maybe would be considered compassion. This one would be, I am worn out by I'm tired of you. And so he has this deep sigh, and in his spirit says, why does this generation ask for a sign? So he's using the Pharisees as a stand-in for, in many ways, all of Israel, who is somehow not accepting what he has already done as a sign. And yet they rejected him. They reject Jesus, and he's done with them. I don't know. From this point forward, Jesus devotes himself exclusively to his disciples, and he will soon leave Galilee altogether and head towards his fate that comes in Jerusalem. So in many ways, this is him washing his hands of that first to Israel, and now his ministry has expanded. All right, so we're going to move on to the next section. We're going to look 14 through 21, right? Would someone read that one for us? Someone read 14 through 21 to finish us out today. Anybody? Okay.
Yep.
Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. They said to one another, it is because we have no bread. And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? Do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. Then he said to them, do you not yet understand?
Yep. All right. So we remember when we said crossing the sea is another chance for Jesus to deepen his teaching or to talk about something strange. So here we go. The disciples are on a boat. They've forgotten the bread. Jesus hears them grumbling about it. And you get the sense at this point in the story, Jesus is pretty fed up. I love the way N.T. Wright described it to those who read this portion as a teacher just at their wits' end, trying to tell someone for the 13th and 14th time how to understand something, and they just don't get it. It's like Jesus can't move on to the next part of his ministry until someone somewhere gets who he is, which is a point Mark is driving at here, that ultimately when we arrive in Caesarea Philippi, one disciple is going to get it for about a half second and then promptly forget it again. But the disciples in the Pharisees seem to have a similar arc, don't they? The Pharisees are confrontational with Jesus. They don't seem to get that the kingdom he is talking about is different than the kingdom they expect. The disciples are not confrontational with Jesus, and yet they don't believe they don't quite understand the kingdom they expect is not the kingdom Jesus is presenting. They understand him in very different ways. And so he's mutually frustrated with them in multiple cases. And he just happens to use bread as a metaphor or as an opportunity to talk about that. Now we're talking about leaven in bread. Leaven is just simply bread from an older loaf meant to, so it's a starter, for lack of a better term, to get things going. Again, this is a Exodus reference. Why is it an Exodus reference? Because when they were leaving Egypt, they were leaving so fast, they had no time to get the starter, to get the next bread. And so that's where this tradition of unleavened bread of the Passover comes from, which ultimately gets, as Christians, transmitted all the way down to communion. So here we are. It's a sea crossing again. The first sea crossing, Jesus stilled the storm and challenged the disciples. Why are you afraid? After the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus sent his disciples on ahead, and then he came walking across the water. And the second sea crossing ends with the evangelist Mark has this comment, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So we even understand back then they didn't understand it. They saw this thing, they didn't understand it, and it somehow made them more cynical. And so the disciples had forgotten to bring bread. One might have first thought that this is going to be like their response to the first one, but Jesus goes in a different direction. Instead, he warns them of the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. Keep in mind, the Herod we're talking about here is Herod Antipas. It's not the Herod the Great. There's Herod Antipas, Herod Philip. Caesarea Philippi is actually a city that Herod Philip built for himself and for Caesar. So its name literally is like Caesar and Philip Bill. It's one of many Caesareas because there's Caesarea Maritima, which is the giant city on the coast that Herod the Great built. And so Philip thought he would be like his dad and he would create another Caesarea, but he would call it after his name too. Herod Antipas, what's significant about him is as a son of Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, among that tetrarchy, those four different rulers that were Rome split up the rule of Judea after him, Herod Antipas saw himself as like sort of the true, the true person that should follow after his father, and he should ultimately unify those areas. In fact, he actually went all the way to Rome, just like his father Herod the Great did, to try to argue directly to Caesar to give him control over that, because he saw himself as the true and rightful heir for things. That was his priority. So his priority in understanding of a kingdom is not the same as Jesus's priority in understanding for the kingdom. So that's Herod's leaven. The Pharisees' leaven is for ultimately the off-throwing of the Roman rulers, the reinstituting of the monarchical kingdom of Israel. But ultimately, what they ultimately cared about is how that kingdom would be ruled, which we remember, what are the Pharisees' priorities? It is to follow the law even more strictly, to build a hedge around the law. So I can't say the Lord's name in vain if I don't even say the Lord's name. It's for them because they wanted to push that priestly level of commitment to the law down to the lowest levels of society. That's what the whole argument with the disciples and their hand washing was all about. Normal, everyday people. Nowhere in the Bible is a command for them to be ritualistically clean on a daily basis like that. Yet the Pharisees wanted what was expected of the priest to be expected of the people, because that's how you could most closely follow the law, is to go even beyond the law. That kingdom is clearly not Jesus's kingdom. These are different priorities. And so when he's calling the disciples out there and having this discussion about leaven, he's reminding the disciples, you need to be clear in your understanding of this kingdom's priorities, because the Pharisees don't get it and Herod don't get it. And I'm beginning to worry that after all this time we've spent together and you've seen me do all these works and signs of power, you didn't understand the first feeding, you didn't understand the second feeding. I'm beginning to worry that you don't understand my priorities, even though you're the people that have been with me the whole time. That's what's happening in this discussion. Yeah.
in defense of the disciples, here we are.
Yep.
So, you know, it's impossible they were.
Yes. Yes. Yep. I think it's that constant relationship we have with the kingdom of God that every time we think it's extreme, it's somehow more extreme. Like we excavate it more, and it's like, yeah, it's kind of the embodiment of the teaching about, what do you do if someone strikes you on the cheek? Well, you give them the other cheek. Well, I've heard you're supposed to, love your neighbors as yourself. Well, anyone could love your neighbor as yourself. That's certainly a high calling, but you should pray for your enemies and those that persecute you. It's like Jesus's priorities. Every time we encounter it, we tend to sanitize it. We get used to living with that sanitized image, but then we re-engage it in a moment of sort of depth and clarity and God breathing. And we realize that kingdom of God is somehow like more extreme than we previously thought. So I'm with you. I don't hold any expectation. If I was a disciple, I would have somehow got it, because we stand here at the benefit of 2,000 years of storytelling and prayer and witness and Holy Spirit. And they are up close and are not getting it. But you can see here in this text that Jesus is a little bit concerned about that, because on his mind, and we'll see it here real soon, he is beginning to understand what the result of this ministry is going to mean for him. And at some point, he's going to have to trust this to his disciples. He's already done that one time where he sent them out 2 by 2, and they did a pretty good job. But you have to imagine he's pretty disappointed that they went out and did all that, had this great experience with it, and then came back and then just still clearly don't understand. Don't understand.
You were talking about.
Yep.
Years of
Yeah, they have no preservatives. Yeah.
Just because they have.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Within that, yeah, they weren't allowed to remember the command when God is providing this miraculous feeding in the wilderness. In the Exodus story, the command was they were not supposed to keep it beyond that day. They were supposed to eat that day, but they were not supposed to collect it and keep it. In fact, there were a couple little stories of people collecting it and keeping it. They weren't supposed to do that. So it's meant to create that we live by God moment to moment. We don't ever like get enough God and then retreat and I just be to myself. It's supposed to be that walk that way. We're constantly with God, relying on God at every moment. Yes. And some people, that's an interesting point where you talk about the Lord's Prayer, because some people have drawn some conclusions to what happened in the feeding of 5,000 or 4,000 with the Lord's Prayer. And part of the reason they've talked about that is because the Lord's Prayer is not in Mark. It's only in Luke and Matthew. Slightly different. In each, I think Matthew has a little more than Luke of it. It could be the other way around. But the level of compassion Jesus demonstrates in the Lord's Prayer is something that people see emulated in these stories in particular. So, people were trying to logically go back through and say, well, we don't see the Lord's Prayer, but do we see the character of the Jesus, that character Jesus displays in the Lord's Prayer in Mark's text? And the answer is clearly yes. So, yeah, you're right. That's true. That's a very good boats and bread. Yeah. Well, wait till we read Luke. I had a professor say Jesus has got to weigh at least 500 pounds in Luke's gospel because he's always going to or coming from a meal. So it's so that there's lots of different interpretations of that leaven in the Pharisees or Herod. Here are some of the more classic ones. Some say it means a false messianic hope or a narrow nationalism. So if you think about that within the Herod context and the Pharisee context, it's salvation for the Jews. For one, it's the recapturing of the Davidic king. The other one, it's for the strict adherence of the law. So the figure of leaven thus describes the disposition to believe only if signs which compel faith are produced. So one person interpreted that in the sense of saying, Don't fall for leaven. And leaven in that case means, well, I'll believe in God only if there is a sign that cannot be debunked by anyone. That might have some interesting purchase today, because so many of the arguments that Christians and atheists have are arguments about, well, what can only be ascribed to God. So that's a common source of argument, particularly when people have discussions about creation, because someone would say, well, the Big Bang can only be done by God, which was, I guess, the original conceit of Hawking and the other groups that came up with it when they originally presented it. But now we've come to a point where a lot of theoretical physicists say, well, you don't have to have a miraculous event anymore in order for that to happen. And so that's been a sore spot in discussion with fundamentalist Christians who are always wanting to try to argue with people. I think if you're going to take this interpretation, I think it pushes us back into a space where there is always enough evidence if you have the faith to believe it. There's always enough evidence that God is at work in this world if we have the eyes of faith and the ears of faith to hear it. And so don't follow the leavened bread of Pharisees and Herod in that world. It could be taken as a bit of spiritual advice of, don't wear yourself out looking for miracles that everyone can agree are miracles. Because if that's the basis of your faith, you're going to have a rough time. Another one, in short, the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of the Herod is unbelief. So some people just saw it as unbelief. Jesus then is warning his disciples against being infected by the same evil impulse that has hardened the hearts of his enemies, the Pharisees and the Herodians. So that's some of the more traditional interpretations of what that means. I think in a practical sense back then, it was just literally don't be by the Herodians and Pharisees, who are obsessed with two different types of nationalism, who don't understand what type of Messiah I'm going to be. But we have the benefit of thousands of years later getting to develop all sorts of other interpretations that might work for us at illustrating our faith. Jesus goes through and asks them a bunch of questions at the end. I mean, I think those can be provocative questions to ourselves. And ultimately, those are questions he's going to try to continue to provoke as he enters Bethsaida, and we see the healing of the blind man. But ultimately, when we end up in Caesarea Philippi, and Peter gets his big moment. So that's really, I think, where we have today to understand. And I think if I were to relate this in a real practical application sense, I think some of the things Carolyn had said earlier or right up, I think those are the most provocative questions for us is, do we actually understand Jesus? Or are we at times like those disciples who see what they want to see for a period of time? I think that's a component of it. I'm sure Jesus is interacting with them. They're probably vacillating between having true openness to what Jesus might be something different, but also at times being completely blinded what their expectations were and having to deal with those unmet expectations. I think about that in a very big, broad sense right now. I think you can see things like that where people go back and read the Bible, read the story and the life of Jesus, and somehow still come away with that. The belief is Jesus is someone that would have been absolutely 100% into American gun culture. And it's like, are we reading the same book? That's a big, maybe perhaps absurd example, but I think we can all see in our individual lives that we are constantly wrestling with the Jesus we expect, the Jesus who created our minds, and having that in conversation with the Jesus as revealed in Scripture and as Jesus is revealed in conversation within the church. We always have to realize that we could be chasing that unleavened bread and not actually fully buying into God's kingdom. N.T. Wright, in his interpretation of this, even took it a step further of pointing out that Jesus's kingdom in many ways can feel very reckless. Jesus knowing that his end wasn't just that he was going to be tested and ultimately win. Jesus ultimately knew that it was going to end in his death, and yet continued to pursue it, which begs the question, or asks the question of us, are we pursuing our faith in similar ways? He's not saying going out with a death wish, or intentionally being provocative like that. But he says, the challenge is, do we have that same level of commitment to our faith, that when we believe in something, know it to be true and pursue it, we can look at that at times and maybe realize that can get us in trouble. But does that stop us from pursuing it? I think there's some churches that are, particularly right now in the Texas area, that are facing that one face on when it comes to some legal issues interfacing with immigration right now. And they're attempting to have great compassion on people who are suffering, and yet finding themselves at the business end of some legal recourse because of doing that. There's some places all across the United States where we're trying to criminalize homelessness, where churches are engaging in ways of protecting and serving and feeding people in that, and stepping into line, stepping into legal quagmires with that. I'm sure there's much better individual, less political examples of just the things that are coming to my mind right now. So who do we understand Jesus to be? Are we really open to the idea of reinterpreting Jesus in a way that is more conducive to this kingdom that he seems to be preaching? And are we willing to follow after him in that kingdom even when we realize it's going to cost us something? Those are elements at play there. Any other thoughts that came to you as you're reading this, Bob?
It's almost like we're coming to answer the question. Who do you say that I am?
Yeah, absolutely. That's there over and over. Who do you say I am? Who do you say I am? Yeah.
Quite a bit of healing. Don't have much information on what he said with the house for the crowd. Like John the Baptist, what is his message for the people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we see Jesus out here with these crowds, but we don't, like we do in Matthew, in particular, hear what he's teaching. And so there are some people that engage that exact question. I can't remember the exact logic for why they arrived at this answer, but I do know I was reading something where they were engaging in this in particular, the feeding of the 4,000. Why were they out there? What was Jesus doing? And the answer they came to was like, well, he's most likely teaching, because that's what rabbis do. Because if he was doing like mass healings, one would think that would have been a part of the story. And so they even asked the question, if he is doing teachings, because all these other accounts have him doing teachings, what is he teaching about? And they came to the conclusion he was most likely teaching about ethics and discipleship, what it meant to follow him. So I don't know. There's a reason. There's some scholarship behind that reasoning, but it is interesting. With Mark, we don't have what he's saying there, but then with Matthew and Luke, we do. Scholars have debated that. I will very briefly touch on this, but in Matthew, we have the famous Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, we have the Sermon on the Plain. Different locations, but they share a lot of content. There are, maybe a good way to get at this is in Mark's gospel, after Jesus is baptized by John, it says he's driven out in the wilderness for his testing, but doesn't tell us anything about the testing. It just says he has it. But in Matthew and Luke, we have the stories that we're all more familiar with, the three different tests, although Matthew and Luke have them in the last two in slightly in reverse order of each other. And so people ask for a long time, the Greek of Matthew and Luke is similar enough that they seem to clearly be getting it from something. Because like, what's the likelihood that two different authors writing at two different times independently write verbatim Greek to each other? It's virtually impossible. So it has to come from something that was written somewhere. And there's about 250 plus verses from Matt that are exclusive to Matthew and Luke that are the same, that are not in Mark. Yes, yeah, which is Quelle or something. It's a German word meaning source, and so they developed this theory that there may be another source. And so one of the ways people think about it is, particularly when it comes, and I'm relating this back to your question about what was Jesus teaching, is they call this the two source method, because there are some elements of John that is borrowing in there as well. So, the theory might be in those early days of the church before these things were written, because it's one thing to say Mark was written in 67, 70, 73, but it's not like there's a printing press. And it's not like there's the official church publishing house. So it took a long time for Mark to be written and then be received by a lot of church, but ultimately in the third or fourth century, for the church to say, okay, this is in the Bible. This is in our New Testament. And so we tend to now talk about two traditions in the early church. There's the Markan tradition, which we have here, which Luke and Matthew eventually pick up and copy off of and expand their gospel. But there is perhaps another tradition, which is the one we would maybe call Q, that's picking up on some different things. And so I find that really interesting, because it means maybe people, in hearing those early stories about Jesus, a certain set of things became more important to a certain group of people. And then another group of things became important to another group of people. Those things ultimately found their way in Mark and maybe found them, it'd be the greatest discovery in the history of biblical archaeology, or at least manuscripts, is to find a copy and someone goes, holy crap, we have found Q. It'd be the greatest thing we've ever found. We've never found it, so who knows?
Preaching is also two different paths. Jesus talking
Mhm.
with people,
Yes.
followed him for 3 days. And they still follow
Yep.
something to listen to Jesus for some reason. But he's pulling some string on either rich and poor.
Yeah.
Things he's talking to, he's got not him.
Yeah. There's people all over the map in these crowds. They probably have certain things in common. They're most likely sick. I was listening to something the other day about the ancient world, and when they're talking about health, and there's a Greek author that a lot of people cite who is being really unique, because he is one of the only authors in antiquity that openly will talk about actually having a good period of health. He mentions, like, oh, actually, I had a period of time where I was really healthy, because it was understood by most other authors that, like, basically everyone living was living with some sort of infirmity, which is not that confusing when you think about, just like, I don't know, let's see how life would go for you. Just stop washing your hands, and then we'll just start eating outside, and let's just see what happens. It makes a little more sense. Yeah, so they would have been sick. We talked about life expectancies and things like that, and how that would have affected their thing. So they would have been primarily poor, but we also know that there would have been a significant amount of rich people. There were probably a lot of rich people that were following Jesus around because they could afford to. Most people believe a lot of the women following Jesus were most likely wealthy. They were just able to do it because they were the wealthy women of a certain status that could afford to do it. So that comes from all the Marys, and Mary Magdalene might have been wealthy women from Bethany that followed Jesus around. So I don't know. It's really intriguing questions. What was Jesus doing out there with those Gentiles? What was he teaching them? We'd love to have those words, wouldn't we? Yeah. Interesting questions. But I think your initial conversation about Marcus trying to get us to ask the question, who is this Jesus? Because again, he's telling it in a unique way, that he's not telling you the end yet. Mark clearly believes Jesus is divine, but nothing at this point in the story has explicitly described Jesus as being divine, the Son of God. He's still this mysterious, quasi-messianic figure that is doing signs of power, and everyone around him somehow is not getting it. So who do you say he is? Which gets back to that big theme of Mark laid out from the very beginning. Are you going to follow Jesus, or are you going to follow Caesar? Which kingdom are you going to be a part of?
What? Moses, the son of David.
Yeah, Mark is not concerned about that lineage in the same way Matthew is. Jesus begins using words like son of man, but son of man's just like saying human being at this point. It later takes on maybe bigger terms in certain contexts, but Jesus himself isn't even necessarily claiming divinity at this point. It's something that is developed over Mark. And so Mark kind of tells you a little glimpse at the beginning that Jesus is really special. In some manuscripts, it does say son of God, but his story builds and builds. And I think I've argued before the way Mark ends, which we'll get to obviously at the end, that sort of dangling, they run away in fear is a way of continuing to provoke that question. Okay, you've heard this whole story. Who do you say he is? So, yeah, hopefully you're seeing all those symbols. And I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot. I found this study for myself to be very illuminating, despite already spending a lot of time with these texts. I love looking at it this close, and I hope you all are appreciating it too. So let's close in prayer, and then we'll be done for today. God, we thank you for your spirit that clearly moves among us when we get together and read your word. We thank you for those who preserved these stories, who passed them on, who wrote them, who preached them, who heard them, who copied them, who translated them. We're grateful that they arrived to us today because they help us to understand you better, to help us understand the life of Jesus better. We're thankful for the Holy Spirit who enables all those things to happen. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.